Gut, dann begrüße ich Sie hier nochmals zum Artist Talk von Jaki Irvine. Sie wird vorwiegend über das Projekt, das wir unten sehen, nämlich If the Ground Should Open, sprechen. Es ist eine sehr komplexe Arbeit. Ganz kurz zu Jakis Biografie. Sie ist 1966 in Dublin geboren, lebt heute aber zwischen Dublin und Mexico City. Sie hat in London am Goldsmiths, wie könnte es anders sein, Visual Arts studiert und also zuerst ein BA in Fine Arts Sculpture am National College of Art and Design in Dublin abgelegt. Sie hat in verschiedenen Ausstellungen teilgenommen. Ich will nicht alle hier erwähnen, aber man kennt sie natürlich im deutschen Raum noch nicht so gut. Sie hat vor allem eben in England, Irland und obwohl sie war mal aber schon mehr als 20 Jahre her, war sie in Karlsruhe, hatte sie eine Ausstellung. Ich will jetzt nicht mehr zu lang reden, sondern a very warm welcome. Sie wird auf Englisch sprechen. Wir haben abgemacht, dass sie langsam spricht, also wenn es zu schnell ist, bitte einfach Zeichen geben, damit wir es auch verstehen. Sie wird ungefähr eine halbe Stunde präsentieren und dann haben wir Zeit, mit ihr noch in ein Gespräch zu treten. So, the floor is yours.
Thanks everybody for coming, and I apologize for my non-speaking German. So I will try to go slow, and please stop me or interrupt me if I'm going too quickly. When I think about If the Ground Should Open, which is the exhibition presented here, it really grew out of this project, which is a book called Days of Surrender. And Days of Surrender is a book published in 2013 by Copy Press. Really it grew from this photograph. I was very curious about this photograph. I was thinking about 1916 and wondering about women and their involvement in this revolution, our Irish Revolution 100 years ago, more or less. And when I saw this photograph, which is really the iconic photograph for Irish history of the beginning of the Irish state at 1916, this is a photograph of the Irish surrender to the British Army. And that's Padraig Pearse with his hat and apparently with his long coat. But there were a pair of feet sticking out behind Padraig Pearse, and it wasn't clear who they belonged to. Within a week of that photograph being published in 1916, this photograph was actually in most of the newspapers, and as you can see, those feet were gone. And in the official, one of the main narratives about Ireland in the 20th century, those feet are still gone. I became very curious about this because those feet were definitely there in the original photograph, and I wanted to know more about them. And I went to the Irish military archives to see who owned that set of feet. They belonged to the nurse you can see here. She was a midwife called Elizabeth O'Farrell, and the other woman beside her was a woman called Julia Greenan, who actually was her lover, her partner for all of her life. And they were in the Irish headquarters at the time of that rebellion. It was Elizabeth O'Farrell who was asked to go out onto the street to deliver the surrender to the British Army while people were being shot and killed, full families with their sheets from their bed, trying to wave their sheets as white flags to surrender, were being shot dead on the streets. So they sent Elizabeth O'Farrell out to see if she might maybe get through. Now all of this is kind of extraordinary, but what for me is more extraordinary was that until I started researching, I'd never heard of Elizabeth O'Farrell. We weren't taught about Elizabeth O'Farrell in Irish history books. And as for Julia Greenan, well, it's still very, very difficult to find out anything about Julia Greenan, her partner, even though they're buried together in the same grave. So I started digging a bit more, and it turns out there was a whole army of these women who we'd never heard about. So I wrote a book. Elizabeth O'Farrell was asked to deliver the surrender not just once, but again and again over the course of days around the city of Dublin, which had different outposts, different rebellion outposts. And she was asked to go and convince the Irish that yes, they had by this time surrendered to the British. It was the British who asked her while they held her partner in Kilmainham jail, along with all of these other women you see in this photograph. But we don't really know about those in Irish history either. That's also why I wrote the book and why I call that book Days of Surrender, because they were days it took her while people were being shot around her, while she was in constant danger, to surrender. They were the days of surrender. So it's, for me, a very odd thing that our commemorating, memorial, celebration is also that we have to accept our loss and what we've lost. Or how do you resuscitate and bring that back again? That's why I wrote Days of Surrender. And that's why I...
Ladies in uniform, what's it?
Sorry?
There had been 2 ladies in the uniform.
Oh yes, but there was a full women's army written out essentially of history. You hear a tiny bit about it, but not the names, not who they were. They designed and made their own uniforms. And sometimes they took second-hand uniforms from the men and fashioned them to themselves. We know about Maud Gonne, which she was a very wealthy woman, but all of these other women really were not spoken about. And Elizabeth O'Farrell and Julia Greenan, there was a third woman in there, Winifred Carney, who was James Connolly's secretary, who refused to be sent out at a certain moment and insisted on going with him with her typewriter under one arm and her Webley revolver in the other, to that final headquarters. Anyway, to move the story along, in 2016 I was invited by Sarah Glennie, who is the director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, to make a work to do with the Irish Rising, to commemorate the Irish Rising. And at the same time I was speaking with a bagpiper who you'll see in the work downstairs, a wonderful piper called Hilary Knox. And Hilary was telling me that the canntaireachd is a system, is the oral way of teaching bagpipes. And partly the canntaireachd became so strong because for a certain moment, about 40 years, something like that, the bagpipes were banned under British law on pain of death because they were a Scottish rousing instrument to, it was considered a military war instrument, and the Scottish were banned from using it. So people taught one another, didn't write down the scores, and they were teaching one another via canntaireachd, which is, so for example, canntaireachd is something that if you would say Hinnerin Fadaro, what you're actually saying is for example. And so it got me thinking, a burl is a brpa, something like that. I'm going slowly enough, right? Okay. So I thought this may mean that every woman's name is actually a melody in its own right, if I can just translate it into canntaireachd and back into bagpipe music. I also became, I went to bagpipe conferences with Hilary, got very involved with all of that, and there was a certain moment when I realized that classic bagpipe, their basic melody is called An Turlór, and An Turlór is the Gaelic name for the ground. And I thought that was a really kind of beautiful idea. This thing is the ground. But but it's also the ground we as Irish people walk on. And I became very interested in that. What if this ground, because we say, well, what if the ground would open? What if they would turn over and they'd be turning in their graves to see what our bankers are doing at the moment? And I became, also, at the same time, of course, in 2012, they started leaking what our Anglo-Irish bankers had been doing. Our Anglo-Irish bankers, which are the male voices you hear downstairs on in some of the works, they were planning what they were doing, they were laughing about what they were doing, they were panicking. And they leaked those tapes online over the course of a few days. And I thought it was fascinating. And I wanted to use these recordings of these people selling Ireland, betraying Ireland. I thought it was such a contrast to what was going on with these other bunch of people who were ready to die for a better Ireland. So really this project, If the Ground Should Open, came from a combination of the canntaireachd and these melodies and this ground, which is the melodies, which are these women's names, if you like, on the one hand, and those banker recordings, which I just couldn't get away from. They wouldn't leave me alone, so I thought I'd just bring them in when I was asked to think about 2016 and 1916. How can you possibly think about that without thinking about the phenomenal betrayal that was 2010, 2008? It's impossible, at least for me.
So what you told, that's the bare bones of the piece. But actually what we see is, probably you could explain what we see and hear downstairs. I mean, there are 8 monitors, and there are different women bagpiping. Oh no. So some are playing the bagpipe, others are reading out books. So just that we get an impression what we see and what we hear downstairs.
Sure. So as I say, this book was published by Copy Press in London. Copy Press is a very small publishing house set up by artists Bit Hopley and Eve Lomax and Anne Talentire. And they had the idea of making a series of books written by artists, but they're not art books, they're simply a series of books written by artists. And at a certain moment, they realized people were reading them and wanted to talk about them. So they set up a series of evenings so that people could respond. Cherry Smith is a poet, and you'll see her in 2 of the works downstairs. And she wrote a poem and another piece of writing as a response to Days of Surrender. And what she wrote about was a woman called Mairead O'Farrell, who was shot dead on the Rock of Gibraltar in the 80s. And she wanted to explore this. She's not innocent. And this is the thing, it's a messy history. And I think for me that was important as well. This is not a clear cut, there's heroes and villains. It's not like that at all. You know, it is a messy history. It is a messy history. 1916 was messy, 1980 was messy. The Irish relationship with the British is messy, as it is with the rest of Europe. Ireland fought on both sides of both world wars, for and against the British, for and against the Germans. The Irish history is phenomenally messy. So there's no, and that has to be taken into account, there's no one perspective to see the full clear picture. For example, I mean, if I'm talking about the structure of the work downstairs, there's no one clear place to stand and see everything. Why should you? Because we actually can't in life, and you can't even in relation to history, for example.
So one of the women is reading out her response or to your book, and probably you could also say a bit more. I mean, it was a commissioned work, but why were you interested to produce a work on this messy history. So how does this work relate to your other artistic practice? Would be my first question. And then the second, what do you think that art can do to such messy histories?
I think one thing, and it may seem kind of ridiculous, but one thing that feels very important is to maintain the mess. Because we've got so many, everybody trying to chip away until you just get the bare bones of the story that somebody thinks is the best thing to sell you the thing. That doesn't feel right. It's not what happened. We all know different things happen in different ways from different perspectives, and if anything, art surely should reflect the complexity and difficulty and unease. I know Cherry, the poet, at one point she was saying to me about Mairead O'Farrell, I can't own her, but I can't disown her. And I think that kind of sums up, I think, a relationship with history that I find very interesting. It's more complex. How do you hold on to the complexities while writing a narrative, while making a piece of art, if you like, that allows not just one emotion, this is good, this is bad, etc., but allows a kind of a fury and a disappointment and a mourning and a rage and a maybe joyfulness and a connection between people, not just one person being the star of the show and everybody else being a supporting act. And maybe that's also why the work is in that shape, that it's all together, you have to move around. It's not just one instrument on one screen, you have to shift, everything shifts and moves, because things move like that, I guess.
And I think it's interesting also how you use not only archival material, but you try also to bring in sound from the streets. So probably you could also relate how you, or explain how you use counter material, or how you approach this whole thing of remembering also through sound and.
Well, one of the ways is canntaireachd for sure, and the pipes, and we know what they feel like at a certain moment. And when Hilary is blowing on the pipes and she's bunged up the end, we know what it looks like. It looks vaguely castrated as an instrument, which of course we all had a good chuckle when we were doing it, but it's kind of obvious. But then I'm wondering, maybe we should just, if you see a bit of sic compra, it makes more sense. I also live in Mexico City, and there was a certain moment when I was living there and thinking a very Irish nostalgic thing to do is to carry Irish singing and Irish song to other places. And then, everybody's sitting around singing this Irish way. And I was kind of curious because Mexico City is full of sounds, and one of the sounds that goes around all the time is a little van that goes, say, compra colchones, and it's a young girl trying to buy, it's a rag and bone van, how do you say it, to recycle refrigeradores, like refrigerators, etc., etc. And so this thing sounds like music. This city has its own sense of music, and I wanted to bring this other melancholic, nostalgic music towards the music that's the music of the city and the sounds of that city. And so I ended up making sic compra, which is coming from the van, Shinné, which is Irish, Gaelga for that's it. So maybe I'll show you a little bit of that so you get a different sense of
same idea, that you try to capture the everyday not by words but by sounds. And for me, it somehow reminded me of James Joyce's Ulysses, just because in James Joyce there is also the idea that he has the everyday, I just want to know whether my track is right or how this fits in the literary tradition of Ireland into your work.
Well, it's funny, obviously we've got the two greats, which is Joyce and Beckett, and they say Beckett turned away and said nothing for a long time, and Joyce said too much, and that's the kind of way they characterise the difference between the two writers. And I'm curious, obviously there are more gestures, and one was highly symbolic, and one tried to refuse the symbolic entirely, so it's, you know, and also obviously both wrote an awful lot of their most remembered works in exile.
But there is no connection, because for me Ulysses is really also the simultaneity of layers of reality, and also to try to capture the vernacular, and so that's there.
I think we come from that stuff. But also, when you claim it as your own, it's impossible not to be nostalgic. It's just what it is. And so, in a way, you know, I wanted to look at where I was and acknowledge where I'd come from, and acknowledge the impossibility of bridging that gap while trying to bridge that gap. So there's this moment, you know, I guess, there are cycles in it, in the way we use in Irish music. There are rounds, there are ritornellos, I guess. There's that sort of way of working, but there's a layering up of adding everything, add as much, which is music in general, but Mexico City and its sounds in particular. It's full, it's impossible to isolate sound. And when they try to do it, they end up isolating themselves enormously from the reality of the rest of the city. And so, but you know, people want to know, why don't you put the studio on one side and all of Mexico City on the other? And that's not the point. The point is, we live in that city with all its cultural and social inequalities and disparities, and I wanted to explore that again, to hold on to the mess in some shape or form.